Well, welcome everybody. We had some minor hiccups starting this webinar, so a few minutes delay, but luckily we have everything going right now. Currently in a new link, but I think everybody is joining in the new link, so we're good to go. And we're very excited to talk about the most effective training scenarios in this webinar. We've got here on my side Danny de Bruin. He's our Chief Experience Officer, so he can tell you definitely a lot about the tips and tricks on creating the most effective scenarios. Myself, Thijs de Vries, CEO of Warp, and we're going to share you the things we know, the expertise we got from working with amazing clients, and all the knowledge here ready for you. Before we really get going, is that although it's a webinar, we will be talking the most. Still, we really want to try to get it interactive. So if you have any questions whatsoever, don't hesitate to ask them. You can do so in the live chat on YouTube next to the live stream. Otherwise, it's always possible to send us an email. That's fine as well, at hello@warp.industries. We'll make sure we'll try to answer most of your questions even during the webinar, or otherwise afterwards in let's say 10 minutes, 15 minutes of Q&A. And I think that's it.
That's all, I think.
Good to go. Perfect.
So I saw some messages that it's working now, so that's good to hear. Great.
Perfect. All right, let's get started. So we'll show you some slides. We're gonna go over to a short presentation. Next, we'll also give you a live demo in our own Warp Studio. We show some different example scenarios and tell you all about them. What's good about them, maybe what can be better, and eventually go to the Q&A. So let's get to the presentation. Just gonna assume everybody's seeing the presentation right now. Perfect. So just as a recap, a little bit of the product we have. This has been shown in webinars, in previous webinars, and it's of course also on our website. I guess most of you know it. Still, just as a small recap. We've got Warp Studio and we've got the Warp mobile VR apps. We're going to talk about the first point actually in the 3-step process to come to VR training scenarios. So first would be the easy creation of nonlinear scenarios. We can do that in our Flow tool. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Second step would be the easy distribution of these VR training scenarios to all major mobile VR platforms, iOS, Android, Oculus. And third of all, it's of course about analyzing the data. Well, step 2 and 3 only make sense, of course, if you got a first good step 1. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How do you, come to the best possible VR training scenarios? What is the process, to come to create these? And what are the tips and tricks we know we have experience by making already, maybe even hundreds of them. So we're going to tell you. First, we wanted to tell you a little bit about scenario-based learning, because that is, eventually what we're doing here. If you look at other forms of training, other forms of learning, it's very often not scenario-based. Scenario-based would be saying that it's about a scenario, it's about storytelling, it's about putting somebody in a situation where stuff happens. And we are specifically also talking about non-linear scenarios, meaning there's one starting point, there are multiple endpoints, and actually the choices we'll make will determine, whether up you will ending, in one place or the other. So you can actually have influence on the story itself, how it unfolds, and you're kind of responsible as a trainee where you end up in a scenario. So this whole non-linear scenario-based learning really works within virtual reality. That's what we see. It's a really interactive form of learning, so it's an active way of learning. You have to make the decisions, and eventually you end up somewhere. We see it working really in problem-based contexts. So take a look at procedures that are taking place in the workplace, for instance. These procedures are always there, to solve problems or to not encounter these problems. Still, these problems are really interesting to take a look at when you're, developing these VR scenarios. So what happens, when a problem occurs? How should you deal with that problem? Non-linearity is really close to real-world environment. Eventually, in the real world as well, you constantly have to make these decisions, and you end up with the consequences of these decisions. So that's what we're looking for in high-quality VR scenarios as well. And eventually, for trainees, it could really improve their decision-making skills. They have to make the decision. They should feel comfortable with making those decisions, and eventually, because they make those decisions, they can see the consequences and they can experience those consequences, and therefore they know what might occur in the real world. So they can feel a little bit more confident in stepping into the real world and making the decisions there. So let's kind of already said it, but let's take a look again at the list of advantages. It's a learning-centric approach, and although it's just a sentence, but it's important in that sense that you have to be in the perspective of the trainee, of the learner. It shows the consequences of the choices, so it's not just the right procedure you're learning to trainees. You're also teaching them, the other paths. What happens if you make the decision which is not the right one. It's really about a problem, it's about a case, it's about one scenario. So we actually always say, create, a VR scenario around one learning goal, around one case. It promotes critical thinking. Trainees have to think for themselves whether, which choice is actually the best one. And for them, it's relevant. It gives them a purpose. They know why they're training those procedures. They know they have to know these procedures and they have to really use them in the workplace. So for them, there's a clear purpose in what the training is about. So that's a little bit about scenario-based learning. In really close to that, it's gaming and the gaming mindset. I just wanted to address this point slightly because it's important to kind of get the right perspective when starting to create VR scenarios. Eventually, it's learning by doing. Trainees are doing, and therefore they're learning. So the interesting part here is that you can actually put trainees directly in a context without them even knowing about that context. They can learn by doing, so you don't have to give them all the theory in advance. You can just, put them right in a training scenario, and if they make mistakes, that's fine. That's good. I mean, those are the moments they actually learn, and they're playing in a safe environment, so they can make these mistakes. That's fine, because if they did it wrong or they end up with 1 star instead of 5, they can just try again. Nobody gets hurt. Nothing happens. Won't cost you a lot of money. If things go wrong, just try again. So it's really that safe environment. The other thing, which I think is really important, and that's what we see, which doesn't go, always right, doesn't always go right, is the fact that people tend to give a lot of information in the beginning. So really try to scaffold that information. So just give pieces of information over time. So don't, trainees eventually will encounter the things they run into. So only give that information, and only that information that is required to make the next step. So don't give them too much in the beginning. It's really important that they should be able to change the outcome. Very often we see scenarios, and you'll see it at the end when we show you some live scenarios, is that the ability that trainees can actually change the outcome. So it's great that they have choices, but if they eventually end up in the same outcome, they cannot change the outcome. So make sure you have plenty of different possible endings. And the last thing, and I think this one, it really helps in creating the best scenes, the best scenario, is the fact that it's storytelling. In the end, it's storytelling. So when you're creating VR scenarios, getting character, think from the perspective of that trainee. What is he dealing with? What is he seeing? How is this comparable to real life? So eventually it's about storytelling in that sense, that you have to give the story to the trainee. You have to kind of guide them in the story, and not and the story should make sense. So trainee cannot hop from this place to another instantly. So make sure there's a story around it. So if he needs to be at location A and then B, make sure there's a story which will guide him from A to B. So think in that perspective.
Yeah, and use everything that's in the environment. So if you have a scenario what's about office, use other colleagues in the scenario as well. So you can use the colleagues to give the trainee some information he need to succeed in this scenario. So make sure to use everything, what's in the environment.
Yep, exactly.
And as well, you don't have hands in VR video, so make sure. Okay, and we do a little. I will tell a little bit more later on with some examples in Warp Studio. But how do you open a door, for example? So think about you can do it yourself. So what are possibilities to do it in a VR training scenario?
Yeah. Maybe already to give one slight, possibility. I think that's something you use a lot as well when creating scenarios, is to be using another character.
Yeah.
So that could work. You're yourself or a character in the story, but maybe there's always a colleague next to you, or maybe there's somebody else next to you. So the actual, opening of the door, for instance, can be done by the second person. So you can easily solve those kind of problems.
Yeah, and also what I see is a lot of customers like to use gut voice. So there's just some information that is voiceover is telling you, but that's not really in the story. So what you can do is give some scripts or lines to another person that's in the environment. So make use of the other characters, and you can build plenty. So a lot of possibilities.
All right, let's move on. Also, just really briefly, we're gonna touch this just to get an idea. I think most of you will know this, but just to get an idea where we see VR fit really well, VR training, where we see it fit. We truly think it's widely usable. So in many different contexts and different industries. One, of course, being safety and security. That's where we see a lot of scenarios actually which are being created and made in Warp Studio. But we see actually more and more the soft skills type of scenarios. I truly think that's super interesting. Think about a role-playing kind of situation. You can record that. You can kind of create a scenario script around that, and you can play scenarios such as leadership kind of skills, giving feedback or presenting to your team, or but also more on the kind of customer experience side. So you can use your soft skills in that sense to be able to give the right experience to your clients, your customers, or maybe to your colleagues. All things that can be trained. Last, the other side of soft skills, maybe hard skills, really technology types of skills. I mean, all things that need to be done on the work floor, as well in the office as really in factory settings, are procedures. And procedures can be recorded, can be scripted. So we do also a lot of engineering maintenance scenarios, which are procedures, but still very interesting to use for VR. Especially because you can look around, of course, which is can be really interesting for VR. But also the fact that non-linearity is interesting here to show consequences of choices, which aren't that great. What happens? What happens if you push this button first before the other one? Maybe everything explodes. Great to practice in VR. A little bit more expensive to do in real life. So we see there, a good fit as well for VR.
Yeah, and sometimes we see clients also combine different two of these three, because with the really technical VR scenario, you can also use some soft skills, or you can also use some. I really like when clients put in some Yeah, just small things you can. I think soft skills would say it, but. So what do you do when you are busy with replacing a tire and you see another colleague doing something that's wrong? Yeah, that's really interesting dilemmas you can put in.
Yeah.
Yeah, great stuff to experience with.
Yeah. And the other thing which could be interesting also to see is, if we can go to the next slide, is the level of interactivity, so to say, if you're looking at VR scenarios. So this will be applicable for, the more soft skills or kind of technical safety kind of VR scenarios. Still, you can think about the level of interactivity. So I think we mostly kind of, have a maybe kind of a love almost for high interactive scenarios. We like that the trainee is really in control and can, make the decisions eventually and kind of replay the scenario maybe even up to 10 times and still, see new scenes, see new videos. So that's on one side, really high interactive scenarios. If you look at role-playing games, they're highly interactive. You're kind of in a discussion with another, person. So it's a lot back and forth, so there's a high level of interactivity there. And completely on the other side, you would have kind of the guided tours. So not so much interactivity. There are some.
Mm-hmm.
You could even debate whether it should have different endings. But just to show you, there is always that option to go there as well. So it doesn't always necessarily need to be highly interactive. It can also be just a few interaction points. You can already reach a lot.
Yeah.
So it's a good way of starting.
Yeah, use VR just to get people in a certain situation, and therefore a guided tour is perfect. You can perfectly use VR.
Yeah. So I think we kind of touched upon, again, what Warp Studio is, about scenario-based learning, so kind of the overall view. You get a bit of that mindset and a bit about that theory on what scenarios actually are. We also addressed a little bit the different types of settings, industries where you can use VR training, also the amount of interactivity. So I think next would be interesting to take a look at the process. So how do you set up a good VR scenario? Maybe also a little bit, how the whole process looks. It could be interesting just to take a look at it. Take a look at that. And next we'll be getting in Warp Studio itself.
Yeah.
That's always interesting.
So let's start with the process, and I have a slide for that, so that's good. This is the same process when I help clients of ours to get to an effective VR scenario. I will use this process, and it starts with a subject, and that don't have to be really in depth. Because when we use a brainstorm session to get all the information. I have some more information on that in another slide. But in the brainstorm session, we get together with different people with different specialties and find out what's really important in this training. And it's what's hard is try to not make it too big. So try to focus on a learning objective, and that's all in the scenario brainstorm. And then we start building the scenario in Warp Studio. Often I do it at the same time in the brainstorm. It depends on the amount of time and how big the scenario is going to be. But sometimes I even combine it. And I'll also have some slides on that. Now, just for the complete image. After that, we prepare filming. We do it also in Warp Studio. So we add camera locations. We check all the scripts. We check if everything is in. We check what props we need, etc. Before we start filming, then we have the filming stuff. We have that's often in one day. We film the whole scenario. Then we have to edit it and put it back in Warp Studio, and then we can publish the scenario, and afterwards you can analyze the results. So what I really like to do is to start with the
Can I
Yeah.
just ask
Yeah,
you a question before, because you were saying, you know, often I start building the scenario during the brainstorm. Depends on how big the scenario is. Can you say something about a small or a big scenario? So what's kind of a small scenario? What's a big scenario?
Yeah. So we say a scenario up to 15 scenes is a small scenario, and between 15 and 25 is a middle scenario, and above is a big scenario. And we try to keep a maximum of 40, 50 scenes. And sometimes it's bigger. I know clients that make scenarios with 100 scenes, but we try to keep it small and keep and then what you also said is split it up in different scenarios where you can give the trainee the opportunity to learn different learning objectives. Often it is when a scenario is too big, there are more than one learning objective.
Yeah. And a scene would be, you know, just a small part with a video, not too long, you know, one interaction.
Yeah. So and scene, what really like is you always have action and a reaction. That's also how Warp Studio works. So you have to do something, and the result is another scene. So with a direction scene, you have to select the arrow to go to the next video. So every scene, not the first one of course, but every scene has a first a reaction of the previous choice that the trainee has made, and then so first the result, and then you have some information or event where the trainee has to make a new decision.
Yeah. All right.
So the next step is the brainstorm session. This is the questions I normally send to our clients the questions they need to think about before we start with the brainstorm session. And so you have some information you already can start on. And in the brainstorm session, we use these questions to just to pinpoint the training and build. And if these questions are in place, then you really quick can make a VR scenario. I had a scenario built last week, and we did it in 3 hours. We built a complete full scenario, and only because these questions already were told. So that's the whole scenario. That's with script, with camera locations, everything was ready for filming.
And I could imagine it's because the fact that the learning objective was very, very clear, and it was just one learning objective.
Yeah.
It was really about one thing.
Yeah.
All right.
So on the subject, what's your current ID and goal? And that's a bit about the first step, the subject, and what's the learning objective? And this is a really hard one to really pinpoint one learning objective, and often it's getting big, and you get more and more learning objective when you're building a scenario. So that's really important in the whole process of the brainstorm, and also with building the scenarios, to keep in mind, okay, we want to provide or put the trainee in this situation, and we ask this question, but what's the learning objective, and what provides it to the learning objective? That's an important question to always ask yourself. So on the brainstorm session, what's the procedure? What's the right path? What we like? What would we like to see that the trainee does? What's the right procedure? And I always start with that, the right path, and then what wrong choices can you make? And think out of the box. Sometimes I often see clients who thinks, maybe that's too obvious, but just try it and put it in. It can always be. You can see in analytics, you can have a conversation when someone's doing it, and you can test it as well.
Yeah.
Often client thinks, no, it's too obvious, but.
I also think sometimes, I mean, I can remember we we did a evacuation scenario in which we also gave the option of choosing the elevator instead of the stairs. And probably most people would know, you have to take when there's a fire, you have to take the stairs, don't take the elevator. Still, you see people making that choice because they always do. And somehow, it could be interesting to see those consequences, to really experience what it is choosing that elevator. And, it will add something to your scenario. The fact that it, maybe seems obvious still can be an interesting kind of choice to make.
Yeah, they will learn why it's the wrong decision.
Exactly.
Yeah, and they can experience why it's the wrong decision. So it's a really an important step in learning. The next step is, or the next question is, what are the consequences of these choices? So what's happening when you take the elevator? What's happening and what's the result? And we often see it's really it's good to give quick feedback. So when someone's making a wrong decision and trainee is making a wrong decision, don't try to not give the consequences 10 or 20 scenes further in the scenario, because then the trainee don't remember the wrong decision that they made. So try to provide it straight after. And it can also be done by a colleague saying, that's a good idea, let's do that. And then he's going to do it, or you together going to do it. Yeah. So try also to use the other colleagues or characters.
And then I think there's the beauty of VR and 360 video as well, to really kind of show those consequences. So I really think about how can I record, a setting like that in which, something goes wrong or somebody makes a choice, to be able to show and experience the consequence. Because it's always the case, which you see in different types of learning, that you would directly say, no, this is not a good choice, so please go back, do something else. But then you kind of miss that opportunity. You miss that opportunity to really show that consequences, and therefore you kind of, take away the option of the trainee to understand why the procedure is, as such, and why, the specific choice isn't the best one. Experiencing it, and learning by doing, which you already said, is, really a powerful instrument to give. To learn a little bit about those procedures. So, think from that perspective, like how can I record those consequences, and how can I show them to the trainee?
Yeah, and I think we have different flavors, because I also had we had a client asking, okay, maybe the situation that we want to train in is too hard or too expensive to make a whole film set around it. You need a Hollywood film set. So what can we do to still give the feeling and the important knowledge about the context, the critical or the problem-based context, but do it in another way. And also there you can use the other characters, because you don't have to see it yourself. You don't have to do it yourself. You can always be feedback from a colleague, and you can still be in the same context and have the feeling, when someone pushes this button, this is the result.
Yeah, exactly.
And the last question, what does this add to the learning objective? I see questions coming in, so I will answer it in a few seconds, Mahesh. Thank you for the question. What does this add to the learning objective? This is an important question with every event or every type of scene you add to the scenario. Ask yourself, what does this add to the learning objective? And sometimes you need to make a scenario a little bit bigger. I have some tricks on that later on, and some smaller. But it's really important to keep the learning objective in mind. Otherwise, it gets too big and it don't add something. When you have the possibility of you have a multiple choice scene with two answers, and they both are right. There's no right and wrong. Ask yourself, why do we want to provide the trainee with this situation? Why don't we make the choice for them if it doesn't matter if you choose left or right? So that's really important.
Yeah.
So how long is a good scenario? It's a difficult question, I think.
Yeah, I think it can be answered kind of from a different perspective. So one would be in terms of scenes, for instance. You know, when you're creating that scenario. Yeah, of course, the answer here is kind of it depends on what it is you want to convey. What's that learning objective? I think I was gonna say maybe we can say how long is a scenario which is too long, but still we are seeing scenarios which are quite long and still they're really playable. So I think it becomes good when you kind of have the feeling as a trainee that you're constantly kind of being, you can't really have that feeling you're in that situation, you're really in that other reality, you're in that virtual reality, you're in a different space, and you really feel like being there, maybe playing as yourself, maybe as somebody else. And we often get the trainees. We heard trainees talking about the fact that they think they have the VR headset on for a lot shorter than actually what it is. So the sense of time is really different when you're, in virtual reality. And I think you're doing a good job when that sense of time is different. I think then you're doing a good job. In terms of how long, I think this kind of touches upon that question as well. How long are trainees in a scenario? On average, we kind of see roughly around 7 minutes. There are scenarios which you can only play for 3 minutes, then you go to an ending. Of course, you can play again. There are scenarios which can take up to 10, 11, 12 minutes. Eventually, this whole concept is about micro-learning, so it's about short amount of time, but doing training, really quantitatively, so doing it over and over again.
Yeah, and I think to add on it, the length of a scenario doesn't make it good or bad. I think it's in the types of question that you ask, in the context that you create, about the story you create. I think that makes a scenario good or effective, so to say. Because you can have one scene with a video of 5 minutes. But takes a long time. So you already know when you played the first scene, it takes 5 minutes. Or you can make, we often make scenes of around 30 seconds, sometimes some a bit longer because there's a conversation between different characters. But it's around 30, 40, 50 seconds. And then we provide the trainee with another question. Or a choice to make, because then they have the feeling it's an active scenario instead of a passive scenario. Yeah. If you have to wait for 5 minutes before you can make a decision, it's more passively watch a video instead of take part of the scenario in an active manner.
I think we're already very enthusiastic about talking about VR scenarios because the time is going forward. So I think we're going to move on. We can talk about this for days. We're not going to. No. But let's keep on going. So
how to get the most of a scenario? How to start at first? Kickstart your scenario. So make a prologue, and that's the trainee puts on his headset and doesn't know who he is. Maybe he's playing a character. Maybe he's playing himself in different context or situation. But make it clear. So this is who you are, and this is what we expect you to do. And good luck. This you also can do not only by a voiceover or by text, also use the other characters. Yep. First build the best path, and doesn't mean you can create a multiple choice question. So I always, when there is a multiple choice question, I make it and type in the different answers that there need to be, and then I continue with the best answer. Because you always need one path that leads to 5 stars. You can only have one path because otherwise, if you have 2 or more paths that leads to 5 stars, the trainee don't have the feeling to try it again because you already have 5 stars, and on the other hand, he can't know what's the right thing to do. So it's the same thing as if you have two answers that's both right, then maybe you don't have to build it in. Then complete the other paths, I already said. So, and how to improve your scenario. There are often, you can make a linear scenario. It's not bad or good, and a non-linear scenario. But it's about making other lines in your scenario, other lines. So build in multiple choice questions or scenes, and make a short story in another branch, so to say.
Yeah.
Create the right tension curve, not too big, not too small, and keep in give the trainee the opportunity to make a decision. It could be just ask a question in a conversation. So maybe there's a conversation between two other colleagues, and then they ask you something after some questions. So you have the feeling, you have the question, and sometimes it also can be an information scene. But just saying, okay, you have to do this. There's no choice, you have to do this. But they select a button, so they have the feeling it's their choice, their decision to do so. And increase the replayability, and that's also about the different branches you can make. But I have some examples on that. And for now, I think because we are a bit running into the time, I continue to Warp Studio.
Yes.
Maybe it's good to tell a small thing about the storytelling. I often get some questions about from our clients. What do you write in a script? And it's about the scene description. What do you see? What don't you see? What's happening? Which characters are in the scene, and how do they respond? And what do they say? All this information you need to put in the scene description, because it's help you or maybe someone else who's filming during the filming to understand what needs to be filmed. And how you can improve your storytelling is create emotion by letting, even when you read it, let us feel what the characters feels and describe what goes on in the characters' heads. You can write it. I have an example on Whiplash. It's a great movie I like. And I have an example how they write their script. So we can take some learnings out of that. Take the time to build up mood and tension. So don't go too quick. And sometimes a little conversation between different characters is nice to build something up, build up the emotion. And you can feel it. You can feel when the actors are playing in a certain emotion. You can feel the pressure or the relief. A little tip, put the attributes in capital letters so you can filter them out later on, but that's for preparing for filming, so a small tip. And it's all in the choice of words. If you how you describe the scene, it's all about feeling, and it's in the right, choose the right words. So what we can see here is the scene of Whiplash, and what I really like is for example, here he says the player are taking their seats slowly. Andrew walks in. Ice drums. There's this tension. There is you already feel how Andrew is feeling because he sees the drums and already feels nervous. He takes deep breath. He can do this. So that's the mindset of Andrew. So I really like that. And also this on the right. This is how I describe what I describe in a scene description. So if anyone has questions about this or like me to send it to you, please send me an email or write it in the comments, and I will send it for you. You can read it through.
Perfect.
So Warp Studio for now. And the first thing I like to show you is about making a scenario bigger or smaller. And in this example, I use, you are in an office and you need to go to the next room. And you are in an office with one door, so you need to go through the door. So you can do it really quick just by saying, okay, in the first scene is the information scene. You're an employee, office employee, and you need to go to the next room. Okay, so in the next scene, there's a direction scene, and he's in the next room. Really small. And I use this when it's not adding something to the learning objective.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's really important in understanding how you need to open the door and that you really need to close the door or something like that, when it's really important to how maybe operate the door, then you can really make it big. And in this example, and I use the same canvas for different scenarios just to show you. You can do this with Warp Studio and create a scenario, because you need one start scene, and that's the one with the green house on the right.
The green icon.
Yeah. Just a side note. So what I did here is, okay, you get the information in the first scene, then you have to stand up, and maybe it's a multiple choice scene. Do you want to stand up, or what do you want to do? Stand up or stay seated? And if you stay seated, then it's an ending. Otherwise, you get the possibility to go to the door via a direction scene. Then open the door via a hotspot. Then a direction scene to go through the door to the next room. When you are there in 8, you have to close the door, and I choose to do it with an information scene. You can do it with different types of scenes. And then you have to select the door to close it. So in this example, I use 7 scenes instead of 2.
Yeah. So in this one, I think it's so you can use kind of the multiple scenes here when it's, for instance, going about a fire. So you really need to close the door because otherwise the fire can get in. So in this case, it would really add something to the learning objective, and therefore it would be wise to use more scenes than just 2, because it will add value. Yeah.
And sometimes you want to make it a bit bigger or smaller when you have the tension curve in mind. Maybe you have the feeling it's too long or too short. And this is the way to give some more choices, or make it some bit bigger or smaller.
Yeah.
So, and the next examples I have is that you really can see from a distance, just by the how the scenario is built on in Warp Studio, I can see what type of scenario it is. So in this example, you see it's a linear scenario. And this are often the tourist guides, or just
kind of a low level of interactivity.
Yeah. And in this example, I build in one multiple choice scene, but it's just low interactivity. It's not good or bad, but keep in mind this is a linear. And what you often see when you play this once, you've played it. There's no new videos or possibilities to discover. In the next scene some clients are building this, and they don't know that this also, it looks like there are a lot of choices and different paths you can make, but what I see here is that... Bit higher?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. What I see here is that when you are in a multiple choice scene, you can choose 3 different answers, and they go to 3 different scenes, but after that you go back to the same scene. So here I can see that there are not really consequences. There's not really a new path you can play. Often this is built with the non-linear in mind. But in the next example, I show you what I think is the more effective way to build a non-linear scenario.
Yeah. So here you can see, although you cannot really read, what's in the scene description or what the title is about or what the scenario is going to be about, you can already see in the shape that there's one starting point, but there's also one end point. So in terms of replayability, of course, you can make different choices. You can play again, make different choices, but you will still end up with the same ending. Sometimes it can be used, to say, okay, I've got a multiple choice. It goes to different types of scenes, and then it goes back to the same one. It's an option, but if you do it over and over again, and really end up with that one scene or one ending, maybe it's not, doesn't really add up to that learning objective.
Yeah, and even in the middle, you see when you have 3 different scenes, it goes to the next one is the same. So it doesn't matter what decision you made, the result is the same.
Yeah.
With the next scenario, and that's a scenario I really like because there's a lot of interactivity, but also you see different endings, and not just here on the top. You see it's a real path you have to play before you get to an ending.
Yeah.
So the result is very quickly. You always, when you make a decision in the next scene or maybe the scene after, you really want to give them the result of their choice, but then it leads to an ending. So when you play this path, if you try again and even go to make the same decision here, you can take another path. There's a lot of to discover. Even when you have it right the first time, you have your 5 stars. You maybe hear other colleagues or other people who also played this scenario that they've seen a whole different thing. So you get, I would get, I really like to play the whole.
Looks interesting. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Only by the shape.
Yeah.
And you see different endings. So 1 starting point and 5 different endings.
Yeah.
And the last scene type of scenario type, it's more about conversation in VR. When you here make a decision, and it leads to different emotions of the other actor who's playing in the scenario. And here you get 2 choices, and you get to a different emotion. You can get up higher, maybe the actor gets angry or sad. And when you give a right answer, he gets into a different emotion.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of different endings.
Cool.
So that's all I have to show in Warp Studio.
All right. I think that's kind of sums it up on which we wanted to address in this webinar. So just as a recap, we told you a little bit about scenario-based learning, about the gaming mindset, what is required, for you as a creator to be able to write these, effective training scenarios. So really, crawl into, I would almost say, into the skin of the trainee. What is he going to see? What's he or she going to experience? And think about how that is going to look in VR with 360 video. Also, kind of as a starting point, so we discussed a little bit the process of going, how to get to a good scenario. So of course it starts with the brainstorm, but the single most important point here is don't make it too big. Make sure it's about one learning objective. Make sure you have the learning objective really sharp in mind, and the consequences of the different choices that trainees can make are all based upon the fact that they will get more kind of experience or information about that learning objective. And we showed how that kind of looks like in Warp Studio. So I think eventually it's about trial and error, just as training is about learning by doing, and it's about making mistakes and just keep on trying. So here as well, eventually you just need to start building those scenarios, see what works, see what doesn't work. We always have this test feature in Warp Studio, so you can easily test your scenarios without the need to have 360 video, so that can already help a little bit. And eventually I would say, we're here to help as well. So if you have any questions whatsoever on building scenarios, or finding the right learning objectives, if you're not really sure if your scenario is the most effective as can be, give us a call. We're really happy to help. I'm pretty sure we're going to see some really amazing scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah, I have nothing to add on it. No, so keep in mind the storytelling, keep in mind the other characters. That's what I really like and what I really add to when we're making a scenario with others. And and don't be shy to start. Sometimes you really have to start, and I love the flow in Warp Studio just to get started. Yeah. And just to make something and push it through on the right path, and then continue. So
I just got this question on our email, asking whether what kind of situations do you see when helping clients in creating scenarios? So what kind of things do they do maybe often, which doesn't necessarily lead to the best scenarios. So what are they doing? How are clients starting?
Yeah, yeah. It really depends. Sometimes the scenario is too small, and when what's then happening is there are not enough or no direction scenes in between. So you just switch to a different environment. Always provide the trainee with a direction scene, so they can expect it and change in environment. And often it's too big, and there have decisions in it that's all right, or don't have one path that leads to 5 stars. Yeah. So that's really the start point, and then I have to make it smaller. Sometimes clients make a non-linear scenario, and that's not. They don't keep in mind the replayability. Yeah. So the replayability is really important for them, and then we have to make some more endings in it.
Yeah, so really think about the different points in which you can make choices. Yeah. Some interesting dilemmas, trainees can bump into.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I often see is that the mindset of, okay, in this scene I do something, and in the next scene I have the result of it. So in the example with the door, when I click open door in scene 1, then in scene 2 the door is open. So that's a result of the action. Yeah. And that often also gets mixed up.
All right. Another question which I think could be interesting to kind of answer is about scoring. We didn't really discuss the scoring or the different scoring methods here. Maybe we don't need to go all the way into that, but when do you apply scoring? So when do you think about scoring? Do you do that already at the brainstorm? Do you already think about, this is going to be some bad choices, or this needs to be 2 points or 4? So when does that come into play when creating scenarios?
Yeah, I first make the best path, then I fill up the other answers that could be answered in the scenario. And when the whole scenario is finished, then I give points. Sometimes I give it straight away. So when I build the right path, I know that all the other choices are. I like to use this subtraction system. Yeah. Because then I know this is the right path, you always get 5 stars, and with the others I can play. Sometimes I give custom points because it's a really, really bad decision. You maybe endanger others, or maybe you don't help the client or insult a client. So it's a really bad decision. Then I give 4 or 5 points, and I know, okay, or maybe sometimes 10, and then I really know he gets just 1 star, and the client and the trainees won't see the points; they only see the stars. Yeah. So you can give as many points as you want. So it depends on. Sometimes I just finish it all and then add the points, and sometimes I already know this is the bad path. So how bad is this decision? Is it 1? Is it 1 star? Is it?
It's going to be more.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I think we can kind of. Ended up this webinar, since we're kind of in an hour already. Time flies when you're having fun, apparently. We had some great fun in explaining you or our insights or knowledge or expertise in which we kind of gathered creating VR training scenarios in the last couple of years. There are some more questions. We'll try to answer them through email. And if you come up with any other questions whatsoever, please contact us. We'll be more happy to help. And I would say see you at the next webinar.
Yeah, see you next webinar. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.